we chose the title Status for tonight, and I think we'll have many different layers of that word to dig up. But to just get started, I'd really like to hear Jin Park to illuminate us a little bit about the status of Im Kwon-taek in Korea.
Well, I don't think I have to stress, the status of Im Kwon-taek, not only in Korean cinema but also in the world cinema circuit. Well, I think it was mid-1980s when his name was revealed to the world cinema circuit with his film Shibaji, screened in Venice. And after that, Cho Hwa-sun and Chun Yang got spotlighted in the renowned film festivals. That's when the Im Kwon-taek was highlighted as the leader or the great master of the Korean cinema. But if you look at his vast filmography, 102, you can find out that he tried so many different things. And there are so many new things you can find out. He tried so many genres, he tried so many subject matters. But all of these are directly or indirectly related to the changes or the turmoil of the 20th century of Korean society, either in commercial way or either in genre way, even in very realistic way. So I think his status is somehow established in a very multiple way in Korea, but also I think his exposure of his films in the International Film Festival, of course, helped a lot to his status. So undoubtedly, he's the great master of the Korean cinema.
If we talk about the international exposure, obviously we have two people here who participated in his international exposure. Maybe you can just give us a little bit of insight into your relationship with Im Kwon-taek. I know it's very vast, and you have a lot of stories to tell us about that. But maybe you can start where your story with Im Kwon-taek began.
It's hard to pick out one film because we have seen over the years and decennies again and again his films, but I think our consideration of his work and his stature has increased in the last 10 years because we got to know him a little better, and it was in 2005 that Berlin Film Festival paid a kind of homage to him, and on that occasion his 20 most important films were selected, and we presented them in the Berlinale and also at the Arsenal, and Im Kwon-taek came here, of course, and we had a discussion with him, a kind of talk, which we did in the Arsenal. And I remember it was one of the most wonderful conversations we ever had, because this man, Im Kwon-taek, has such a high reputation that you think he's like a giant, but actually if you get close to him, he is completely normal, he's abordable, he's a human being and completely open, not arrogant in any way. And so it is wonderful to talk with him, and we had a prolonged conversation about his work and about Korean cinema, Korean history, because his biography has interesting backgrounds also. And I only regret that this was not recorded. We should have recorded it. It's a pity. But we got to know him pretty well, and he has a formidable talent. I think a sense of cinematography, of course, but also he has a human dimension in his personality and in his films, as we can see here. A sympathy and empathy for his characters, which is remarkable, and it expresses in his direction of actors and in his direction, in his editing the film, and in many factors. So even if this is film number 102, it's almost unbelievable. That, so this is the record. I mean, his age, he's now about 80, I think, and he's still going strong. And we met him at a festival in Jeonju. I think that was, we met him in Korea. Jeonju is rather far away from Seoul, several hundred kilometers, and he was driving his car in the night back from Jeonju to Seoul. We were most astonished that he was still doing that after a long meal with many drinks. Yes.
I met him for the first time in 1998. There was the first Busan Film Festival, and he was the chairman of the jury, and I was in this jury. And when you are in the jury with one person, you learn to know him or her very well. And I can only say that he was one of the nicest persons, and we had long discussions about the films we saw, and I absolutely wanted that Chinese film should win, which we had found and shown in the Forum, which was in February, and Busan was in autumn. And I tried to be very careful. At one point he smiled and just said that I already noticed that this is your favorite, but I'm absolutely with you, and we had really a lot of discussions, but always in a very nice way, listening to one another. And I can also say that politics were very important for him. We talked a lot about Korean politics and German politics, and there are a lot of similarity between the two Koreas, and it was shortly after the reunification of Germany, and practically everybody I talked to at that time was hoping that something could also, like this, could also happen in Korea.
You are very familiar with a lot of his films, obviously. So I was wondering, for you, how did this film feel in the context of his work? It's maybe a very late work of his, and did it feel like, what was your impression of the film? Like, how did it feel to you in the context of his other works?
I was a little bit reminded of another film, which is one of my absolute favorite. It is called Festival, and it is about the dying and burial of an old lady. But that film is at the same time humorous and very sad. So at the same time you laugh and you cry. But here it is more deep, more human, and I can only say that it is for me a great film and a very human film.
And I think in the connection to other films by him, there is an emotional character of the film. This is a rather emotional film also, but I think the emotion is subdued. It is not played out, it is not exaggerated, but it is reduced to the necessary dimension, but not beyond the necessary dimension. I noticed several times in the film that when there's a strong emotional scene, he is cutting away from the scene rather fast, rather abruptly, so as to not to underline too much. It's also his actor. I think this main actor appears in quite many of his films, I think. Wonderful actor, and he has also a subdued way of playing, almost emotionless in his face, and almost nothing changes, but this gives a very strong expression, the reduction of movement, of changes, and not so many changes. And well, what else could we say? It's another Inquantec film, and there are parallels, but it is a film which we can accept and which is which has a human dimension. I think that is maybe the most remarkable. It also tells you things about Korean society, about behavior, about people working in offices, how the offices are, and spaces. He makes use of spaces. There are things which appear somehow Japanese. I don't know whether this was introduced by Japanese occupation, but the way the people deal with each other, the bowing, constant bowing, for instance, the Japanese custom, but also in Korea apparently. Yeah.
There are a couple of things. I mean, we're gonna go beyond the films and in contact, but there's a couple of things in this movie that relate to the question of status. And Heide, I was wondering on your take on those relationships that are full of questions about power and beauty and establishment and trying to make a career of yourself, and how you read those aspects of status and power and empowerment.
Yeah, first I have to say I was very happy that there was no happy end in a way, and I was not sure if it would be some or not. So I was really happy about this. The other thing is that I think the film is also about surfaces, and surfaces are built by power, or they are an expression of power, or power is showing up in the surfaces. It's the surfaces of the cosmetic industry, it's the surfaces of the high-tech medicine, and the surface of the funeral, the rituals, and so on. So I think it's about the surfaces, and then he tries to show humanity, which is maintained in this context of power and building up surfaces. So this I find interesting. There are two. Just everything goes out from this man. It's really a man's film for me. But the man who's not identical with the power context he is shown in and he is living in, but there's this difference, and it goes in two ways. The one is the material basic of human living, that is the flesh and being born and dying and so on. So so the film is showing this basic of life, and the other thing is a dream. I think this dream that relates to the woman, and this is also an aspect of humanity and the human being. That I think is great in the film. On the other hand, I thought it's really much of cliches. And the music for me was so maybe enough.
I would like to contradict Heide. I think the film has a happy ending, because it would be awful and very disrespectful to this man if they had an encounter. So I think it is very much in the line with this society that he does not have this encounter, and it shows the director's respect for his character.
Yeah, which is expressed in the line delete. Delete on the smartphone. And but I noticed also that the hierarchy in the organization of this company is underlined quite strongly, because there is an enormous hierarchy. The middle management and the lower management, and then the presidency, and this man says he should do this and that, but he says he's only a salary man. By the way, a Japanese term, salary man, and he has not so much influence. But maybe he can become vice president. So they're talking about this eventual advancement in the hierarchy, and maybe earning more money. So the hierarchy is constantly evoked, I felt in this film, also by the behavior of people. The man who supervises the villa, the holiday house, also is very, very unterwürfig, submissive. So these things are also small indications, not augmented in a dramatic way, but they are always present. And I thought this is interesting. It indicates another parallel between Japan and Korea, because in Japan, of course, you have also the enormous hierarchy. And Korean films are very popular in Japan. We heard that several times. Maybe when they make films in Korea, they are even thinking about how will the Japanese audience react. Is that so?
I have to agree with that because you know the culture, the hierarchical culture, especially in Korea and Japan, is very similar. So I think a lot of Japanese audiences can be connected emotionally to the film, I guess. But I have to say, I agree with Heidi and I agree with Lee and Erica here because I think it's a huge male fantasy. The film is, but I think the approach of the filmmaker to the character, or in this film, I think it's very not simple. It's very multiple. Somehow, he has a respect to this character surviving in this hierarchical culture, and I mean not only the company, but in the Korean society where the middle-aged married men on certain social status cannot express their desire, which could not be admitted in society. So I think the text of this film shows some very multi-way to show this man's predicament, not to follow his desire. So it could be very man's film, and there are cliche images of a female sexuality, especially the corporeal images, eroticizes of the body of the young girl. But I think it's probably the textual symptom to show Mr. O's desire, because he doesn't know how to express his desire, only in a cliché way. So it's very, very interesting to me. It's too cliche to me at first sight, but when I finish the film, at the last, maybe he doesn't know how to follow his desire, and as well as not show his desire at all. And that's actually sometimes most of the middle-aged, established Korean middle-aged guy faces in terms of the concept of status in society. I think the film somehow depicts that situation, but also in a sort of cold but respectful way for the character, yes.
From the Korean perspective, and also a question to the audience members from Korea, maybe we have an audience mic, by the way, everybody is invited to join. Did the film feel subversive to you in a way? Did the film feel subversive to you?
Subversive. I could read that. I could read this text as a subversive, but I think in one text style is not really provoking. I mean, giving the provoking topics. I think he has a very. This film I felt very cold and distanced, and very sort of objective, eyes to O's situation and his inner state of mind, but I don't think it's overtly subversive, overtly. But there are some implications we can read. For example, I was very, very interested by the images of genitals. I mean, both female and male genitals indicated in the film, which was quite rare to see in any of Im Kwon-taek film. Of course, not in a sexual way, but for example, Mr. O has a problem in urinating, and there's a constant imagery of his the ill wives the genital area, which actually in Korean cinema culture are not really rare to show on the big screen. Not in a sexual way, but I think those kind of things are somehow directly, indirectly fabricated into his Im Kwon-taek's perspective or eye to the Mr. O's predicament or the situation as a middle-aged established guy.
I have just something which comes to my mind is that he is very nice towards the dog. Even he gives up the dog in the end, but somehow.
He has him killed.
He has them killed.
Well, yes, but it's a bit paradoxical. But you have a feeling that he is somehow attached to this dog. And it reminded me that in many other Korean films there is a lot of cruelty, especially against dogs. Sometimes in earlier Korean films it's quite terrible, the behavior. They are beaten and they are cut up. I think they're even eaten, but they are treated in the most terrible, cruel way. And by the way, it's also interesting to note that in this film there is almost no violence. It is contrary to the mainstream of Korean cinema, where you have an abundance of violence. Violence is quite terrible. It's stronger and stronger. Not in all films, but in many films, I must say. And here there is a total absence of violence, and this is an achievement. I think it's wonderful.
I would like to say one word again to surfaces, cliches, and happy ending. If the filmmaker would have followed this male imaginary, which is imaginary cliches, then it would have come to a so-called happy ending, which isn't indeed a happy ending, but he is distanced from these fantasies in a way. This I also appreciated very much. And there's another thing I wondered how this relates to Korean culture, that they had been so eager to put away all the things of the late woman, the woman who died, and also that the dog had to be killed. But before this, all these belongings, which could be, we could remind the woman, they had to be put away, destroyed. Has it to do with this Korean culture?
That was also interesting to me because it's not a part of Korean culture. I must say, because everybody has a different way to mourn and remember the beloved one who passed away. So it's not even the common way to represent this kind of story or relationship in the most of Korean cinema or the literature. So I was also very astonished at why this guy acted like that. But we can tell that he loved his wife. He's so devoted to take care of her for longer than 4 years. That's one of the ways that most of the Korean guys can show their love. They don't say really, "I love you, darling," but they take all the burdens to take care of their beloved. So I could be connected with that status, situation. But why he has to get rid of all the belongings of his
past away? The doctor said at one point, why are you so quickly?
So I thought that it's not a part of culture, but I think it's a part of the way to show that his inability to deal with his emotions or desire. I believe that he will miss his wife until he dies, but I think somehow he is in lack of showing his affection or emotion or even frustration, because he got so many moments of being frustrated, right? Especially in terms of his relation with the young girl, but he doesn't know how to express it. So I think that's it seems to me it's kind of act of blocking anything that any situation where he can be emotional, because he could not know how to deal with. But that is not from the common Korean cultural aspect.
There's a question in the audience.
Yes, it's a question for a Korean guest. Hello. I would like to know how common is the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice in Korea. The myth of Orpheus and Eurydice.
Greek mythology.
Oh, I see.
Yes, the myth. So is it very well known? Because for me the film was mostly also with this narrative structure of flashbacks, so many flashbacks, like an other narration of this myth.
Korea has its own myth, and there are many myths. from thousands of years ago, but yes, we're very familiar with Greek myth too. Yes, we learned, yeah, exactly. We learned that from school, and we are supposed to read some of the, the selected part of the Greek myth because it's too huge. But yes, in the course of education, we are very familiar. And sometimes some of Korean films or literature can take the motif from the Greek literature, or Greek myth. So yes, I have to say yes.
I'd like for us to move a little bit further away into questions of status in general, because since we have you here and we're here at a kind of statusless or whatever kind of event outside of the statuses, I'd like to have a little bit of input in your experience of how status of filmmakers can maybe be created, or how you tried maybe to put something against the status that was already established in your own line of work of exhibiting films, and whether that was also a kind of impulse.
Maybe one way to achieve status is not to care too much about status, and not to worry constantly about creating your status, but just doing the thing which you like to do and which hopefully is somehow useful. And of course you need some reverberation, you need some echoes, you need the press, the critics, for instance. But there are maybe in the field of cinema other factors. The cult around the film, how is the cult created? And I hesitate to give a recipe for that, but I don't know, if a film or a personality remains in general knowledge over a longer period, that is a definition of the status of the cult. And this is brought about by the people who work in the field of cinema, operators, by festivals, also by picking up films again, once and again, caring especially for directors. It's something which I found which is important, that you must care about certain directors or authors. If you estimate, if you love their work, then you must watch their development, you must not drop the contact. And even if there is a film which is not so strong, you should also support this film, because the personality is important to you. So this is, there are several ways to build up the status of creative people. Incontec was sometimes compared to John Ford or to Jean Renoir, huge figures in the history of cinema, Jean Renoir in France and John Ford in American cinema. And so some people consider Incontec as similar in rank and in status, maybe on a worldwide scale.
I can give you an example on status. For instance, I remember we had, I think, the first or second film by Kaurismäki, and it was in the Forum, and it went practically unnoticed. Although I thought it was a very interesting film, it was Hamlet Goes Business. But we liked the film, and although the critics didn't write, the public didn't care, but then there was the next film, I don't even remember the title, but we liked it again, and we took it again, and he came, and it was in the Delphi in the evening, and it was full, and it was a very young public, and I was standing there, and suddenly I knew this was it. And then there was a discussion afterwards, and I knew the next morning Kaurismäki would be famous. It has to be the film, it has to be the audience, the time, and the place. And it was that the Delphi was full, and there were lots of people, and the way then he did his press conference, not press conference, the talk with the audience, that also did it. But you cannot predict. You can only hope that the films you love will be loved by other people. You should never take films because you think the audience would like them. Then the film is lost, you are lost and the audience also. We have only taken films which we could defend. And sometimes the audience goes with you and sometimes not. But then maybe the audience is at fault.
I think Incontec has made 102 films by now, and I think you can say that he has acquired a reputation and a status, but in the middle of his career, when he has made maybe 50 or 60 films, by the way, he considers the first 40 films of his career totally unworthy of any attention and doesn't want them to be shown, which makes one suspicious, by the way, because there are filmmakers who say their early work is nothing, but it's not true, maybe. But anyway, I don't think that in the middle of his career, until film number 60, he has achieved a notable reputation. It came about through some of the big festivals, like Cannes, Venice and Berlin. They establish something like a reputation when the film is introduced into the competition or the important programs, and when it is written about in the magazines. Everything must come together, and then Incontec became the powerful figure internationally. Before that, I think he was maybe considered highly in Korea, but certainly not outside from Korea.
Well, that's actually true. Well, I think Incontec really meant when he talked about his previous 40 films or 50 films, because it should be examined in terms of the Korean film history and how the Korean film industry has been like for the past 6 decades, because even 3 decades ago, the filmmakers could not control over his entire production, and there were a lot of interference and intervention. So most of the films from 1950s until 1970s, well, there are a lot of variety of the Korean films produced at the time. So even for Korean film critics or scholars, when we look into the films of that period, we need to have some imagination, or we need to get some historical information. How was it like? But in the meantime, at the time that Incontec was not outstanding among the other the filmmakers of that time, but I have to admit that his exposure to the International Film Festival actually made a lot of Korean people, including Korean critics and the film people in the industry, look back what he has been done, what he has been doing. So his earlier films actually got the spotlight after he got the fame. He renowned at the international film circuit, and we are very, very surprised at how wonderful, how great his film was, even from 1960s and 70s.
Yes, but quite a number of these films are lost. And don't you agree that the Koreans have not been nice to their director? For instance, my second favorite director is Kim Ki-young. And he has made the most wonderful films in the 60s and 70s. I've seen only 5 because the rest of them is lost. And he could not make films in Korea for 20 years. And when I met him, and I said in Busan that I had seen his films and I will bring the films I've seen to Berlin and they will be shown, and then then he said, hopefully, I'm 77 and I have 20 scripts in my house. I would love to make films. Do you think they will maybe, and I said, maybe they will do that. But then he died. But 20 years he could not get money to make a film, although the films I saw are amongst the most extraordinary films I've ever seen.
Thank you for pointing out, Erica. There are different reasons, but first one is the instability of the Korean film industry those times. So the prints could not survive. They didn't really feel the need to preserve the prints, and if the filmmaker could not be successful in the industry for several years after several box office flop, well, it was very harsh for him, even though how artistically achieving in his films, but it has been very difficult for the Korean filmmakers in 1960s, 70s, and 80s. That's why there are many films we could not see by Kim Gi-young, or even in Won-taek. I think there are many films that we cannot watch because prints is not available. Prints are not available, so that's a part of Korean film history, which is kind of, I feel sorry too.
When I hear you talk, I kind of feel like what you're saying or implying is that reputation or status is something that happens and that you can't really build, or that isn't. And I'm kind of wondering whether Heide Schlüttmann agrees on this way of status just happening, or what are the instigators for that?
I have to say, I can't deal with status. I have to say, it's for me, it's not something I relate to. And I think in film history there are millions of films that had no status and didn't survive and so on. And for me, early cinema, when I came about it in the 80s, it was one thing that it had no status, and I felt attracted by it. And there are no names, famous names, that never became famous. And in the Netherlands, they started in the late 80s, they started to preserve only bits and pieces from films. Nobody knew who made it. Nobody could find out who the actor was, or sometimes there was, or mostly there was no actor, but they had been in an aesthetic way, maybe also on behalf of the content, have been interesting, so they preserved it. And I think this is a good entrance to film history, to look what you see and not to have names in your head and status and so on. So that you can also say, a filmmaker who you appreciate, he makes a film and you say, no, it's not good. So you have to be able to. And for me, it's much too much famous names that determine the conscience of film history. So the first place I would say status. What is it? And what does it tell us? Tells about power for me.
So what does it tell us when we have a Berlinale competition with so big names like this year? Don't you want to say anything about that?
No, I don't want to say anything about the competition. And I must say, when we started the film, we did not believe in a competition because you cannot compare films. There is an Italian man, Chiarini, who once, a film historian, who once, he tried very hard when he was doing Venice to get away with the prizes, and he said a wonderful word. He said that film festivals are not a horse race. In a horse race you see which horse is first. But in a film festival you cannot have prizes. So when the film started, we thought, if we like a film, if we select a film, that is enough. And we want our public to see these films and discuss these films and learn about other people and other countries, and no prizes. But of course, a big part of the public and the press, look at the newspapers, what they write about. They write 3 pages about a shitty film in the competition, and then they write 5 lines about a wonderful film in the forum. That is also, I have to give the ball back to you.
Not me personally. Maybe someone in the room, though.
Director can also achieve status by erratic, eccentric behavior, like not appearing in public, like Terrence Malick, who never appears in public.
Makes one great film after the other.
There are other examples like Kurosawa, who refused to come to press conferences or even to festivals. Well, just once. And I remember a press conference of him in Cannes where he apologized because the film he had made was not good enough. And he has realized this, and he must still work to improve his quality and hopefully to be better in the future. So he apologized. I can't even remember which film that was, but it's a typical behavior.
Yes, but that was what he... That was sincere, because he made these films as well as he could. And I talked once to his assistant, and she said when everything was finished and they were looking at the finished film, he was deeply depressed, and he said, this I could have done better, this I could have done better, but it was too late, the film was finished. So he really, it is not only a Japanese convention to apologize, but it was also that she said that when he had seen his finished films, he could see his faults.
So you just said you didn't want there to be any competition in Forum, but when did you accept prizes to be awarded at the Forum?
Yeah, in the beginning we really thought that prizes must be abolished, there shouldn't be any prizes. And, but then after a couple of years, filmmakers themselves came to us and asked us, what prizes do you have? We said, we are against prizes, we don't, each film should be equal. What, you have no prizes? It's not possible, you must have prizes. So there was like a demand coming from the creative side of cinema, and we thought we will not decide ourselves which is the best film, we will appoint juries from the outside, a few of them. Like Fipressi, we estimate, of course, Fipressi and those awards are, we value, for sure. So, but we accepted the prizes because the demand came from the filmmakers.
The best prize we ever got was, I think, the second or third year of the Forum, when Fipressi gave us the prize for our whole program, which I thought this was really it. And but I must say that
you can't do that every year, I think.
no, but that was for the selection. And but then the Tagesspiegel, which at that time was a poor West Berlin paper, they thought we should have a prize, and they said they would offer money. And when I heard money, I was starting to think, because our filmmakers are very poor, and they said, would 20,000 marks be enough? And I said that we will accept. And we had poor filmmakers. We had the first film by Rajan Kö, which he had made as a student. His professor even told me years later he didn't know that his student was making a film in his hometown. And Rajan Kö told me that he had made this film with the equivalent of 6,000 marks. And when he got the prize, 20,000 German marks, he said to me, now he can make his second film. So in this moment, I thought I could accept the prize.
I think encountering status is always an invitation to challenge it, and I feel this was probably also an idea of the first Critics Week in '64 and of the Forum in itself, to challenge the authority of Berlinale. What would you say?
Yeah, we thought at that time that Berlinale was terribly bad. We hated more or less this festival because of mediocrity and about submitting to pressures from governments or industry. And we wanted to oppose something entirely different, which was made from the love of cinema as an art form and without compromises. So we should try to set an example.
Couldn't you say exactly the same about today?
Today it is completely different. At that time, governments, countries would propose the films, and the festival would take it. For instance, Italy would propose a film and the Berlinale would take it. And Mosfilm, the Soviet Union, when it started to come, proposed a film for the competition, and they were deeply shocked when we said that we don't take a proposed film, but we choose our own films. And this has changed. If now there are faults in the Berlinale, it is the faults of the people who make it and not the countries, I hope.
But the festivals have become so big that it is very difficult or maybe impossible to give a general judgment about the quality of a film festival, because there is an abundance of film titles, and maybe with some luck and intuition you will be able to find some good films after all, or maybe you will just about miss these good films, and when the festival is over people tell you this and that, oh, I'm sorry, I missed that film. So that's a common experience, but in the early times when we started our work, festivals were much smaller. I mean, there was practically the competition, and that was it.
Two films a day.
There was not much more, and therefore you could express your judgment, and we were very harsh, very radical in our criticism. Sometimes, if I read today, which has been written in the 50s or 60s, I'm a little bit afraid. I think it's exaggerated. But I remember in the magazine Film Critique, of which I was a collaborator also, Enno Patalas wrote one report about the Berlinale at the time. It is Midnight, Dr. Bauer. And this was an allusion to a film title. It's Midnight, Dr. Schweitzer. This film was very popular at the time, and Dr. Bauer was responsible for the festival at the time. So he wrote It's Midnight, Dr. Bauer. Generally, we held the festival in contempt, but maybe it was a little exaggerated, but there were some good films there were also. There were some films by Bergman, some films by Godard, which somehow slipped in, but the general impression was one of mediocrity, I must say.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah. I agree, Erika, that at some point it made sense to give prizes because filmmaker got some money and could, as you said, do the second or third film. And, but maybe the Verband der Filmjournalisten, Filmkritik, maybe we should think about not giving prizes anymore. We should reconsider at least this practice and this habit. What do you think?
Yeah, maybe we should also think about what is filmmaking. And I mean, the Cahiers du Cinéma, for example, have the approach of writing about films to create ideas of how to make films in the future and maybe to become filmmakers as well. I think this is maybe a more suitable or maybe substantial approach. What do you think?
Were you thinking about abolishing the prizes, or were you thinking about abolishing the prizes we are giving out, the yearly prizes? Were you thinking about them?
And all this ceremony to give prizes, I think it's a kind of outdated in a way, maybe. We should think about it.
But even the Cahiers du Cinéma, I think, published their list of their supposed 10 best films for each of their collaborators. But of course everybody is very curious and reads this list. It's a kind of a prize-giving ceremony also,
yeah,
even from Cahiers du Cinéma, so it seems to be somehow inevitable.
No, nothing is inevitable. And it's also that every film critic, there are points written above or at the end. So this is also now a habit, and it hasn't been so.
Sometimes refreshing is zero.
Yeah.
It's also a price, negative price.
Yeah. So it's, but maybe we should work against it.
Maybe you should change it. Maybe every year one person has to stand there and he gives the prizes alone. And he just says the film I loved best for this and this reason. And the next year somebody else. That would mean that one person is confronted with it and has to defend it.
The prizes must establish a status in themselves, maybe, by a very particular orchestration. If you read the list of the zeros or maybe the 3 points. So the character there should be, depends of each individual, of course, how many zeros and how many 3 points, and for which films. That can develop a kind of personality, a kind of image, or maybe status.
Are there any comments or questions in the audience? We have a microphone for you here. Feel free to join.
Please say something. We can't see you.
I like to say I really like the idea of the one person having a responsibility for a prize, because I think the problem often with prizes is that you feel the critics have found somehow a victim, and then everyone goes for this one film, and then they get this prize, and then they get another prize and another prize. And I think your advantage of being critics, and you're the first to see new films, and by showing us moviegoers what is an interesting film, should be more radical and not this consensus stuff. I have the feeling it's often about consensus, because there's more than one person in the room who have to agree which one should get the prize. So I like Erika's idea.
Yes, and if you only do it one person 1 year, even when the people are angry with you, it will be over next year. And it is actually not my idea. It comes from Finland. When in the 80s I asked how come that suddenly you have a lot of interesting films. They said, well, we have a new concept. Every year one person reads all the scripts and decides which films should be made. And every year it is another person. But every year Chaosmaker got money by a different person. So it is possible that one person has loves one film and pushes this one film, and it is not anonymous. What I do not like is that people say, oh, it is not me, or it was my majority vote. I always felt that when you do a festival, or you are in a jury, you must be able to defend.
That's the main criteria. You must be able to, even if the film is not perfect, but you must be able to defend the film. Yes, that's most important. But it is not a prize, it's just an attitude.
But what you perhaps don't know, that just your prize was given by this procedure. So one critic has chosen you both to give you this prize of honor of this year.
We cannot contradict.
Well, yes, it's actually, running the festival with status. It's very difficult to say against it, but I think, the status, in perspective, why the way we use the concept here in the discussion, it's a sort of indicator that how complex the film culture is now. And I think film festival is also a complex venue for a different interest or different desire. Or there are desires, or there are, the appreciation of the pure cinephile, but also there's always interference from the industry and even political interference. So there are multi-layered in the film festival now, and I think it goes to the criticism now too. What is the status of the criticism? If one critic can find a winner and give the award, who give the power to this critic? And what is the power? How the power of the criticism could be established? I think that also should be in scrutiny. So this indicates, I think, in the culture we are living in now, is all the classic, the ways or institution that we used for appreciate the art or culture or film should be multi-angled, examined. I think status is the very interesting and smart concept to put all of this multi-layered situation we are living in on the microscope, including the criticism.
It sounds like status gives you freedom or gives you liberties to decide something when you talk about the status of someone awarding films. And obviously status can also mean the opposite. Status can limit your options. The status can mean that you have to stay in a system where you have to find ways to keep your status or to advance your status.
I mean, looking at the situation, that's how that you can fight or you can find another alternative way not to stay in the system where the status is the bullshit and it just we need to follow it. But I think what I meant is the status is not given by one single power or one single person or one single institution of this society. It's always interwoven by the different forces of different interest. That's what I stressed. So the status, when it's used as a powerful tool in any social strata, I don't think there's only one way to fight against it if it is used as a power. Of course, I'm not talking about the individual filmmaker or individual figure, but status, as you mentioned, it's just a village in a very complex way. So we need to look at all this fabrication and orchestration, how the status stands and established as a powerful tool. That's what I meant.
I must say that the situation today is worse than ever. For instance, when we had the so-called socialist countries, they always had to fight against censorship, but they could make the films. They were maybe forbidden afterwards, but they were made, and later we can see them. Nowadays, I meet directors from the so-called socialist countries, and I read wonderful scripts, and I would love to see the films, and they say they cannot make the films because the producers want that they have such and such person, such star, and the star has to be bankable. This is a word which is absolutely in use, that the star must be bankable, and the money comes in when there's a star, whether he fits or she fits the film or not. It must be a star to be bankable, and then you can make the film. So a great number of probably wonderful films are in our today's society not being made.
Heide Schlüppmann, you're rooted in a feminist tradition. You've been a professor, a film scholar, and a critic. So you have a certain authority, you could say, to spark discussions. I didn't want to use the status word. Yeah. Yesterday we talked about provocation and decided to not use it anymore. But yeah, you have a certain authority. Would you agree? What do you use your authority for?
Sometimes it seems so that I have a certain authority which I can't handle it. So, and status does also put limits to my relation to other people. When I became a professor, this status alone, I had taught at the university before, and I was very relaxed with students, and we could discuss together, and they didn't consider me as some higher figure, authority or so on. So when I became a professor, this changed. They saw in me an instance, an institution, and also I should have the power to give points, credit points today, and it had been good and very good and so on. And I didn't like to give those points. I didn't want it, but I had to. And so they considered me through this image of an authority that could decide upon what they did at the university. I could get through and I could subvert it, but nevertheless it did put limits to my communication with other people. And in the feminist context, it's dubious to have an authority in it, I think, on many levels. So, and it's more, I have always more the feeling that I belong to the 70s, and I've considered at one belonging to the 70s and coming out of it. And so this is not just the status, it's also being past or something like this. I don't know. Belonging to the past.
I heard, I don't know if it's true exactly this way, but I've heard that Ulrich Reger, you were offered at least once to become the head of the Berlin Film Festival by the Berlin Senate, and you refused.
Yeah, sure. There was such a possibility, but I said no because I don't want to enter into an area which is not my area and where I have to make compromises, submit to pressures maybe, and talk to people or negotiate with people whom I don't like. I have no connection with them, and I have no feeling for their work or their output. It's a completely strange area for me, whereas in the field of films which we have been dealing with, I could relate to these films, I could relate to the filmmakers. They are near to me and I have a feeling for them and I don't have to make compromises, and I think. So this other area was for me very negative and I said no immediately. Although some people later told me it's wrong, because if I had accepted I could better protect the area which is really my concern, just by using my authority or maybe the status which I then acquired. But this was for me a terrible idea. I said never, never am I going to do that. Yes, and later from some people who did it, I heard that it was my decision was good. Yeah. I didn't have to, I could remain myself.
Godard once said about the unholy alliance between Mosfilm, Cinecittà and Hollywood, and he was absolutely right, because you have to deal with people whom you do not want to see their backs, and it is impossible, and you have to make compromises if you do a competition. You can't do it otherwise. Venice tried at the end of the 60s to abolish prizes and to do a festival as they wanted, and they collapsed within 2 years. And in West Berlin it was absolutely impossible, because for once it was a showcase of the Western world, and when the Eastern countries came, they also wanted to show their best films. And I can assure you, even we had the most atrocious battles with Goskino, the Soviet, who never in the beginning wanted to give us the films we wanted. And for instance, if you wanted to have a black and white film, they said, why do you want to have this poor black and white film? Do you want that your public thinks we can't do color films? You know, things like absolutely incredible.
And as a festival director, you must find an opening film for the competition.
Preferably a different one than
and
what we saw this year.
Very much one article which Mr. Martenstein wrote several years ago. He said that the most terrible punishment for a film lover or also for a film critic is to be imprisoned in a room and to watch without interruption all the time opening films from Berlinale. It's a bit unjust, because even in the forum we had to find an opening film. I know it's difficult. Sure.
There's one thing that struck me when I heard that you refused to become head of the Berlinale, is that I tried to project myself into the people that could be asked in Germany, who could be asked to be the next director of the film festival. I know it's not going to be anytime soon, but whenever that happens, my projection would be that no one of the people asked, even though they might want a specific form of a festival, none of the people would reject the offer.
That's quite possible. Yeah.
Then you don't know enough.
It's very difficult, because as festival manager, you should have certain qualities. You should know something about cinema. You should have a taste and a good degree of information, but also you must be a diplomat, and you must have connection with the industry. If not, it is impossible. So, and it's almost never possible to find someone who has all the criteria at the same time. It's, I think, almost impossible.
You must shake hands with politicians you do not like.
You can have one criteria, but then you don't have the others.
Are there any comments to that?
What is the status of the audience?
Yeah.
0.
Any status left in the audience?
We really like to listen.
You like to
We
listen?
like to listen, yes.
So it doesn't mean we have to stop talking if you don't?
I think that you should have a festival which is not gigantic. Today, most festivals, or some of them, are gigantic, like Berlinale, but you should have a smaller one, like the festival in Finland, Festival of the Midnight Sun in Solenküla. I don't know if anybody knows about it. It was directed by Peter van Baak, who recently passed away, unfortunately. Or maybe Bologna, I hear, is also very good.
Huge. It's terrible.
It's terrible.
It's terrible?
It's a nightmare.
A nightmare?
Yes.
I'm sorry. How about in Korea, Jeonju? We were once there and we rather liked that festival.
I have to say, they also facing how to deal with the status. I mean, to make one. Because, you know, Jeonju is very interesting film festival and love the festival as well as the city. But also they need to fight to win the status, to secure the finance from the Korean government first. And then they need to get the, you know, status from the Korean authorities, which is very important to stand high in Korea. And then they need to gain status in the international film festival circuit. So even though the lineup and the atmosphere doesn't look, the festival doesn't really go for the status, but truth is they are also pursuing it. And that's a reality actually. But I think there are always many different corners. I mean, even though, I mean, at the Berlinale, there are many different corners, and you can actually make a lot of different types of encounters with the film, with the, you know, people probably. And then I think status, I mean, the concept of status, what is status? I mean, it's the projection of your desire. It's sometimes the sign of your frustration. So I think there's always constant negotiation with your social image, which, you know, translated in status. But you know, status sometimes is a limitation of what you really want. So I think, you know, status is, you know, the field that you're just constantly fighting with, negotiation, because we cannot stand as what we think we are, right? I mean, the festival is also the same. I think so.
Maybe once you have conquered it, you must give it up.
Yeah, I think the status of festival has changed, because in the 70s people went to the cinema and they could go regularly to the cinema and see interesting films. And then once, twice a year they went to a festival, and this was a highlight of the year maybe, and they concentrated and they looked together in a group of cinephiles and other audiences. They looked at the films and it was a feast, it was a real pleasure. But today you can't see the films in the cinemas. In Berlin it's different, but in other cities it's really poor. So you go to festivals to see films, and it's taken away from the everyday life and cinema going, television and DVD, and so yeah. But it's obviously not replacing the cinema. So there are these festivals, and they are increasing in numbers, and also they become giant the giants like the Berlinale. So I think it's really the status of festivals has changed.
There's a comment in the audience or a question.
I have a question. We are here at the Woche der Kritik, at the Critics Week, which was a wonderful experience so far. Also, I was here only 3 times, and which is independent from the Berlinale at the same time, but independent. Now, if the Berlinale would say, that's a great thing, come to us, be part of the festival. I would like especially to know from Erika and Ulrich Gregor, should the Critics Week say yes, or should they stay independent?
I think the independence should be kept, but you should try to find more integration into the general lineup of the festival. Maybe be part of the catalogue or something like that. The question is how far away from Potsdamer Platz can you be? Although this is a nice place, but you have too many steps to come up to the cinema. But I think independence should be kept, and this is true for the other festivals which also have Critics Week, like Cannes or Venice. They are administered and created and controlled by film critics, by association of film critics, and I think that's a reasonable way. It should be like that. You shouldn't give that up.
Independence is not a question of money, but of mind. And I think if you know what you are doing and if you are really dedicated, you can be independent in every connection. When we started, everybody said that for the first time we had been working for 8 years without being paid and doing everything ourselves. We only paid the bookkeeper with 250 marks a month and the projectionist, because you have to pay the projectionist. The rest we did ourselves, and when we got the money from the government to do our festival, then we said just 2 conditions. Condition number 1, nobody ever interferes with programming. They were so in need that they said yes. And the second was not little bits of money for this and this, but a whole lump of money. Because when you get money in small tranches, then they can say, maybe you don't need this for this. But when you say you need the whole sum and you decide how you do it, then you are much better off. I remember that when they said yes to that also, and then the board of directors came and said Mr. Gregor should come and discuss the budget with them, and we had very little time to prepare, and Ulrich really had important things to do, so he said, you go, and I went there. They were utterly shocked. They were elderly gentlemen in black suits, white shirts, which were probably ironed by their wives. And when I had to wait outside, and I heard that they said inside, Mr. Gregor sends his wife. And then I had to go in, and they were all sitting behind real tables, and there was one chair alone for me, facing all these gentlemen. I was so furious that I put out my old pieces of paper, because I'm very, very careful with everything. And I said, I'm listening. And then they said things like, and you know, Mrs. Gregor, the budget, 25 to 30,000 marks you need for flags. And I said, which flags? Well, the flags of the countries which participate. And I said, in our festival, no country is participating. And then they were utterly shocked, said, Mrs. Gregor, it is an international festival. Do you only want to show German films? And I said, no, we have already 18 films from foreigners, but I'm quite sure that our directors, just as me, don't want to see the flag of their country. It went on like this, and later, one of these men, so you must also sometimes also give men the benefit of the doubt, years later he came to me and said they were all shocked. They were all sure that the festival would not succeed. It would be horrible, horrible. But they had to put up with it. And luckily, the critics went with us. and the public went with us. And so later even this one man helped us secretly. So you can do it, but you have to get the money as a whole, and you have to have it written down that nobody interferes with programming.
Talking about independence.
I just wanted to make a small remark about the development of festivals. I remember the first festival I ever went to was in 1975. I took a train and a boat to Copenhagen to attend one of the earliest international feminist film festivals.
When?
In 75.
We did it in 70.
No, it was an international women's film festival in Copenhagen. We don't have to argue about flags and who was first, the hen or whatever. Ever since, and it's becoming a phenomenon that I have no explanation for. And it's something that's paralleled in the art world with exhibitions, you know, this enormous crowd that attracts, that, you know, these festivals and events attract. And now you go to a festival not to see films, but to miss films, and I find that incredibly frustrating. And Bologna is a very good example. It started 25 years ago. I think we took part in one cinema. And now you have about 10 cinemas, and you don't meet people anymore. That's one thing, because everybody is in another space. And then you meet people, and you realize you have missed and missed and missed so many films. This cannot be the idea of a festival. You think so? I mean...
But it seems a kind of almost inevitable rule that if you start something interesting small, it grows and grows, and it reaches the point where it is enormous, but you cannot reduce it anymore.
But maybe that's not interesting anymore.
Probably you have to start something quite different from scratch, from zero.
Yeah.
Again.
There are many festivals, small festivals now.
The same development will take place another time.
Yeah.
Busan Film Festival is the biggest film festival in Asia. At the last edition there was a large scandal because the programming team chose to show a film that kind of offended the government in a way. And it was very interesting for me. I was there to see how this huge event still managed to take kind of a political standing point, and if it would have been less large, it wouldn't have been perceived in that scale. A lot of directors and producers expressed their solidarity. Could you explain a little bit about the reactions that were going on?
I'd like to hear the explanation to myself, but maybe there are other some reasons. Because Busan is big, maybe that's why. And maybe this government is not that tolerant, maybe that's why I'm compared to the previous ones. But I think this political intervention or will of political intervention in any cultural scenes has its risk. I mean, it can come up every time from out of blue every corner in such a developed, you know, society, I guess.
But the film was shown, wasn't it? It was shown. It was shown. Only the...
It was shown. We didn't. But the bottom line for us, the programming team of the Busan Festival, was keep the artistic freedom. I mean, keep the freedom of keep the right to program the film that we think we need to defend. That we're gonna show it no matter what comes. I mean, against it. So we stick to our rule. I think it's the cardinal rule for any film festival or any curating position to defend the art that they support. So we're very proud of, you know, keeping this rule. And now still we're facing a lot of, you know, troubles. Many people suspect that this documentary or programming this documentary could trigger, but there are other factors too. But anyway, well, it's actually give us a big challenge to Busan Festival. But I have to mention that I'm very interested in the changes in the film festivals for a long time. But in Korea, it has only 20 years. Busan has the longest history of international film festival in Korea, and it's just 19 years, last year's edition. So it has been only 2 decades, but we experienced dramatic changes. At the first few years of Busan Film Festival, it was a storm of the cinephiles. It was like enthusiasm we could not really feel. I mean, I could feel because, it was only 20 years ago. But soon, it became the social institution, and it's acknowledged as a national asset, because Busan is now acknowledged as the biggest film festival in Asia, and there was so many nationalistic interests projected into the festival. And there are other festivals too, and Jeonju also, they has their role. I mean, the festivals has a role, industry and political event, or a nationalistic desire, or anticipation, or whatever. So it soon became a huge social institutions, which could be very, what can I say, influenced, easy to be influenced, easy to be interfered by so many different social power. I'm not sure that if I say I'm lucky to experience this for the past 2 decades, but I could see it. So I think it's, it clearly shows that how the film festival stands its status or its position as a field of, so many different interests. Anyway, sorry, I need to, I would like to make a stress to it, because that's from my experience.
By the way, we forgot to mention among the festivals which have Critics Week, Locarno. Because Locarno has also a Critics Week, and it is a particularly good one, because it has a relatively small program. I think they show only documentaries. That's in a way maybe a limitation. But they show, I would say, 6 or 7 films, not more. And it is a very good selection, I must say. Some masterpieces have been there. And it is entirely independent, although integrated in the festival. It's in the catalogue and everything, but it is an independent organization of only film critics.
Well, in the spirit of independence, that's a good way to end our evening about status. So maybe not reaching too much status tonight, and we'll hope to see you again tomorrow for our final night of Critics Week, 2nd edition, and it'll be the lives of the victors, and you should I don't get the English title. Man müsste Räuber sein oder zumindest Sprengmeister, yeah. So come back tomorrow. Thank you very much. For participating. Thank you.